Too much indeed.
It's nice to be here, by the way. I live in London, but I'm from Buckley in North Wales, so I feel slightly at home. It was interesting during the election campaign that a group of young Turks, political advisors, we've heard a lot of them recently, got together at Downing Street and had a discussion about how to engage young people in politics. And they came up with the idea that in the future, online voting would be key because interactivity matters to a generation of cyber youth. With this in mind, a week before the election, tens of thousands of 18 to 20-year-olds were sent text messages by the Labour Party reminding them to vote. They said that they got the idea from the Channel 4 Big Brother phenomena, where you could be texted on the latest shenanigans between Helen and Paul. And because more people voted in Big Brother than did in the European elections, a lot of politicians thought that they'd steal some ideas from the TV world. And already we can see that as Pop Idol has even beaten those records, that we're going to have something of a singing contest at the next election, I think. Now, I don't know if you're like me, but I thought it was an absolutely ridiculous idea that the young could be enticed into voting for any of the political parties by the use of new technology. The political disillusion with politics amongst the young is a lot deeper than any whizzy website can solve or any trendy text messages. And I was rather actually disappointed, I hate to insult my host, but to see that the BBC online learning has imitated this style. They've now got text bites for revision. You can sign up for text bites that text you through a bit of a revision each week. And I do think there is something going on at the moment where people think that you can impress the kids and make education right on by using ICT. This prejudice that ICT in and of itself makes education more compelling or attractive to young people is dishonest. In truth, despite what the BBC website says, no amount of text messaging can make revision fun or sexy. It's painful. But it also betrays a common misunderstanding, I think, of the possible uses of ICT in education. I detected a similar sentiment when Greg Dyke, Director General of the BBC, actually launched the BBC's new commitment to online learning, when he said that the BBC had to make children's content, and I quote, as compelling and personal as the computer games that children adore. And he called for education to, and I quote again, rise to the challenge of the PlayStation generation. Now, maybe I can forgive Greg Dyke for confusing education and entertainment. After all, he's in the entertainment business. But unfortunately, Greg Dyke is not alone in making this confusion. Michael Willis, when he was the Technology and Learning Minister, asked that educational software be made more appealing so that school lessons could compete with the sort of games that children were used to. So I just want to unpack this idea of education and entertainment being compared as similar phenomena. And I want to assert that I think they are very different phenomena. I think it's wrong to use ICT to suggest that entertainment or education are comparable or equivalent. Actually, and in reality, education is often pitted against entertainment. Teachers have always had to compete with childish distraction. The Game Boy is nothing new, although in the past it might have been Barbie or football, or in my case, an obsession with improving my two-bally skills. Teachers had to wrench me away from those childhood obsessions and tell me that there was something interesting to learn in the classroom. Now, we as adults, I assume, know that knowledge is wonderfully stimulating, but no child spontaneously agrees. And I think every teacher knows that every lesson is a battle for the hearts and minds of the children you're teaching. Now, to try and sell education as fun and on a par with play, I think it does a disservice to pupils. I think we actually have to ensure that our pupils know that learning requires concentration, application, hard work. That actually, it's rarely immediately fun. That is the difference between it and play. And by the way, that includes learning with the aid of ICT. One of the most insidious aspects of the confusion between education and entertainment, I think, is the idea that ICT makes education more compelling and more relevant to young people. Now, I really hate the concept of relevance as it's used in contemporary society. I always want to reach for my gun, as they say. Think about the contemporary discussions of relevance. When the people in the media get together to discuss how they can make relevant news for young people, they come up with the idea of showbiz news and infotainment. The idea that if you have a few soap opera stars telling you about current affairs, that will make it sexy. I find it patronising, and I also think it limits what I consider to be a very important news agenda. In English literature terms, when teachers are discussing how they can make the English literature syllabus relevant to young people, unfortunately, when I was teaching in Watford, the general consensus was that we ought to teach train spotting rather than Henry IV Part 1, because I can assure you that train spotting was a lot more relevant to my students. But I actually think that we were doing them a disservice by making that point. Actually, education needs to challenge the familiar, the everyday, and the children's world, and introduce children to new worlds. And part of education is actually making the irrelevant wonderful. Otherwise, I don't think anyone would have succeeded in making Chaucer work as an educational tool. But if you do it right, even though he's irrelevant to the contemporary world, he's a wonderful educational inspiration in English literature. Now, you may have been following the US educational debate, which has looked at this issue of relevance and has actually called on educators to relate to children's culture much more directly and become even more relevant. It actually has been suggested that proper recognition is given to the educational content of texting. To quote one of the theorists on this, this texting is subcultural activity taking place below the desks. And in America, it's been suggested that this is brought into the open, that teachers should recognise and give rightful place to this new skill of texting, this new learning tool. But can I just get you to consider what is the content of pupils' texting? If you actually look at the content of pupils' text messages, I've only looked at a small sample, but I can assure you that they're as banal as teenage gossip always was. And the technical restrictions of the medium, by the way, prevent you from saying very much. I feel that there's a danger that we're being dazzled by ICT and that we're treating texting as another ICT thing as educational. This imbues ICT with special magical powers. But I want to ask you, in truth, what is the difference between today's texting and my passing notes around the class in the past? Now, maybe this obsession with texting and making it educational is just a US fad. We're far more sensible here in the UK and especially here in Wales. But actually, if you look at the research and the new body of literature that's coming out in terms of the background and the theory behind the introduction of ICT into schools, you'll find that there is a growing obsession with out-of-school use of ICT. This obsession with out-of-school use of ICT implies that there's a great deal of educational learning going on outside of the classroom. And there's endless research projects into people's home interaction with network technologies and projects into techno-popular culture outside the classroom and so on. At first I thought that this was looking at, and this would have been quite sensible, the kind of use of ICT, for example, using your mum's internet to research an essay. But I discovered that this was not the kind of out-of-classroom ICT that was being looked at. Instead, no, it was electronic games on games consoles, computer games, DVD players, and yes, mobile phones and text messaging. Pupils are being asked to log all of their use. And the theory goes that this playful interactivity with ICT outside of the classroom means that learning is happening, even if it's incidental and non-intentional. But even though it's incidental, non-intentional and not understood, it's actually, it is argued, as important as classroom learning. In fact, there are those who bemoan that this non-school learning knowledge and skills of texting or putting the DVD player on are not being validated by schools properly. And there's even calls for national tests and GCSEs to somehow find ways of capturing the holistic picture of ICT learning that would allow us to recognise play as educational. I think there's a really big danger here, that we rebrand both the activities associated with leisure pursuits and play as educational, and also the banal skills of manipulating ICT technically are becoming the educational ends in and of themselves. We are in danger of fueling a dangerous premise that the educational end point is interactivity, participation, ICT use. Stephen, in his presentation, said that, and he laughed when he said, content is no longer king, it's been dethroned. And I think he's right, that's true, but I happen to think it's a disaster. Too frequently, the new pedagogies put forward by the IC technophiles are indeed content light. The content of what is taught is sidelined and sacrificed to the ICT package. To give you the example of one illustration was a Macbeth ICT package which was demonstrated to me. It was a wonderfully exciting package in as much as the students were able to decide what the characters wore in the play. They were able to use different voice and tone of voice for each character. It was demonstrated to me how you could do different versions of, on screen and through interactively, the Three Witches or Lady Macbeth and so on. And it was told to me, would make Macbeth come alive in the classroom. But I would put it to you that some of the most brilliant Royal Shakespeare Company directors are still in dispute about what tone of voice Lady Macbeth should use at certain points in that play. That the only way you can decide what tone of voice you can use or what clothes or what stage directions anyone can follow is through studying the play. The content has to be king, otherwise all of that ICT packages is process, not product, playing, not learning, and certainly not being taught. My fear is that the way ICT is being talked about is actually celebrating ignorance and telling children that it's actually knowledge. We have to be very careful that we recognise that children don't need ICT to learn. And one of the worst aspects of this debate is we should also remember that to be a good teacher, you do not need to be ICT literate. Now, at this point you probably think that I am a complete technophobe, but I'm not saying that. I think that ICT is an incredible tool in the classroom for both the pupils and the teachers, but it's not essential. It is not by its very nature educational. And I think that the idea that ICT is going to transform and revolutionise learning really is making the mistake between the medium and the message. But it also underestimates, I think, young people's potential. It's as though in this debate about ICT, we have decided that the only way young people will get education is if it's entertaining. The only way we will be able to tell if they're engaged is if they're participating or doing. It was actually said to me that what I am doing to you now, you are all sitting listening and I am talking at you, was boring, unengaging and leaving my pupils passive. I hope that you're not being passive in this, because I hope at least there's a bit of grey matter going on and there's a bit of intellectual engagement. To confuse activity with hyperactivity and doing is one of the big mistakes of our age. So ICT is a brilliant learning tool, but it's not a panacea for all educational ills, and we should not underestimate children by thinking that they're the Game Boy generation. They're a lot more than that. Thank you very much.
Claire, thanks very much indeed. Plenty of food for thought there, I think, and I've seen plenty of scribbling going on during your
As long as it's only scribbling.
During your speech, so I think the intellectual engagement was going on, Claire. And we're just wondering if we have any questions from the floor, because obviously that was quite controversial. And anybody got any questions? Yeah, here we are. Gentleman here. Here's Adrian again, zipping across in his trainers. Gentleman in the yellow shirt.
I'd be
Is the microphone switched on?
Should be.
Yes, it is.
I'll be controversial back and ask if you're the leader of the Institute of Ideas or the Institute for Luddites. To say that teachers don't need to be ICT illiterate in a time where where ICT is now a life skill, I find that stunning. What are you personally happy to have teachers out there that can't even communicate with their children when they talk about ICT?
The point that I was making, there's two things about what you've just said. The first thing is that one of the ways that this, my position is dealt with is constantly to suggest that it means that you're a Luddite. It's usually actually that people are less polite than you. People say, you're old-fashioned, elitist Luddite. You're one of those teachers who doesn't want to give up power to the pupils and so on and so forth. I've heard it all. I think that there is also a real danger of thinking that ICT, modern and whizzy, can modernise what's happening in the classroom. I mean, the truth of the matter is that when I had a terrible class on a Friday afternoon and I couldn't think what to do with them, I took them to the Learning Centre. That's what I did, and that's what a lot of teachers do, honestly. So just because ICT's there does not mean that actually anything is happening. That's my only point. I hope that this government will spend a lot more time, money and energy in training people into how to use ICT, because I actually want teachers to be able to use it brilliantly and wonderfully. But at the moment, what are they suggesting? ICT will take over from teachers. We'll have classroom assistants. Don't shake your head. That's exactly what happened. Estelle Morris says, at the same time as ICT is bigged up, we don't need teachers anymore, do we? Not really. We all know what's going on. There's a good dose of honesty is always useful in these things.
Any more questions? Our sound men are here with the microphones ready. There's a gentleman at the back there in the black suit. Could you stand up for me, sir?
Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed.
I don't know, it's really just a response, I suppose, more than a question, but just to say there's a nice contrast between what Stephen Heppell was telling us and what you've said to us, and I think what you've said is very important. We shouldn't just take these things for granted. I mean, certainly Steve had a lot of important things to say about the value of processes like the summer school concept, the UltraLab model, but these are not the norm, these are not the mainstream, these are not the kind of techniques that we can easily bring into mass education. And certainly in my observations of secondary school classrooms, I already begin to see quite a lot of disaffection with the use of ICT as taught in classrooms to pupils. And obviously in 10 years' time, the problem we've got to face is that for children, ICT will be yet another thing they have to do. So I think what you're perhaps hinting at is that there's a deeper underlying issue about disaffection with the process of being educated, of which ICT will not cure. And maybe there is another issue about values and approaches to education that we've got to tackle. And I quite agree, ICT should not be seen as a panacea.
Thank you very much indeed. Once again, beaten by the clock, Claire, so that's unfortunately I can't ask you to respond to that, but thank you very much indeed. So, ladies and gentlemen, Claire Fox.